Corey Vale was only 13 when he killed for the first time, calmly, precisely, and without remorse. The world called him Britain's youngest killer, but what no one knew was that his story didn't end behind prison walls. Years later, under a new name and a new life in America, Corey's darkness would resurface, exposing a horrifying secret the governments of two nations tried desperately to hide. Please subscribe for daily new update of Crime Story and watch till end. The small coastal town of Windermere had always been known for its quiet charm and sleepy atmosphere. It was the kind of place where strangers stood out, and every face on the street was familiar. Children played by the harbor, shopkeepers chatted across narrow lanes, and the church bells marked the rhythm of ordinary days. There had never been a serious crime, no reason to lock doors or glance over shoulders, but on the evening of June 4, 1998, that calm broke forever. When 12-year-old Elliot Maris failed to return home from school, the town's peace shattered like glass. At first, no one panicked. Elliot was a responsible boy, bright, polite, and well-liked by teachers. His mother assumed he had stayed behind for football practice or gone to a friend's house. But when dusk settled and the streets emptied, worry began to spread. By nightfall, his parents called the police. Officers combed the roads between the school and his home, shining flashlights through hedges and drains. Neighbors joined in, their torches flickering like fireflies in the dark. The air buzzed with anxious whispers. For the first time in Windermere's history, fear was stronger than familiarity. Posters went up the next morning, Elliot's face smiling from every lamppost and window. The local news aired his photograph beside words no one ever expected to hear. Missing child. Reporters arrived from nearby cities, turning the quiet town into a scene of flashing cameras and tearful interviews. Police dogs searched the woods, divers scoured the lake, and volunteers walked miles of coastline. But days passed without a trace. Every lead ended in silence. Every clue dissolved into confusion. People began locking their doors. Parents escorted their children everywhere. The sense of safety Windermere had once treasured was gone. The town started to fracture under suspicion. Rumors spread about drifters, jealous classmates, and strangers passing through. Some blamed the new families who had moved in from the city. Others whispered about curses and bad omens. Beneath the surface of shared grief, something darker brewed, an undercurrent of paranoia that made everyone look at their neighbors differently. Yet amid the panic, one boy seemed unaffected. 13-year-old Corey Vale, a quiet student from Elliot's class, barely reacted to the news. While others cried or avoided the subject, Corey sat alone in the back of the classroom, sketching shapes in his notebook. Teachers assumed he was coping in his own way. He wasn't close to Elliot, they said. He was just quiet. No one paid him much attention. He lived with his elderly grandmother in a modest house near the edge of town, rarely seen outside except for school. His calmness was strange, but in a sea of grief, it went unnoticed. As search efforts dragged on, frustration grew. The police began to wonder if Elliot had run away or been taken far beyond Windermere. But deep down, some locals felt something worse had happened, something born from within their own community. The forest beyond the school loomed larger each day, its trees whispering secrets the wind refused to carry. Beneath the calm surface of the town, a hidden truth waited to rise, silent and patient, ready to tear apart everything Windermere believed about innocence, safety, and the darkness that can live inside even the youngest heart. Corey Vale had always been the kind of boy people forgot existed. Teachers often described him as polite but distant. A student who handed in perfect assignments yet never raised his hand in class. His classmates found him strange but harmless. The sort who sat alone at lunch and stared out of the window as if his thoughts were somewhere far away. At 13 he had a face that gave away nothing, no anger, no joy, no fear. Behind that blank expression, however, something far more complicated was forming. Something no one in Windermere could have imagined. He lived in a small, weathered house at the edge of town, with his grandmother, a frail woman who believed he was simply a quiet boy, burdened by loneliness. His parents had moved abroad years earlier for work, sending money and postcards that arrived less frequently with time. Corey rarely spoke about them, and when he did, it was with an odd detachment, as though they were strangers. His room was a reflection of his personality, neat to the point of obsession, everything arranged in perfect lines. His books were stacked alphabetically, pencils sharpened to the same length, and his bed always made with tight corners. Nothing was out of place, ever. While other children played outside or gathered at the arcade, Corey spent his evenings reading about crime. He collected newspaper clippings about missing persons, solved mysteries, and unsolved murders. He wasn't interested in the victim's pain or the sorrow of families. What fascinated him was how people disappeared, how fear could erase a person so completely. He took notes in a secret journal, writing down patterns, methods, and theories. He studied maps of his town, marking paths through the woods, old service tunnels, and forgotten landmarks. His curiosity wasn't harmless, it was precise, methodical, and disturbingly analytical. When Elliot Maris's disappearance made the evening news, Corey sat in front of the television and watched every detail with still eyes. The photo of the missing boy, the footage of police officers searching, the sound of a mother's trembling voice. It all seemed to capture his attention, not as tragedy but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. He knew the roads Elliot took to school. He knew the time he usually left, the shortcut behind the old railway fence, and the hidden path that led to the forest. These details had been noted long before Elliot vanished. At school, as grief and fear spread through classrooms, Corey observed everything: the crying children, the worried teachers, the reporters outside the gates. He listened carefully to what people said, recording small facts in his head. He noticed how panic made people forget things, how chaos erased logic. He understood that when fear took hold, truth became fragile. To the rest of Windermere, Corey was just another grieving classmate. But inside his mind, something cold and calculated had already taken root. He wasn't frightened like the others. He was curious. He didn't see a missing child. He saw the aftermath of a perfect plan. What no one knew was that Corey's fascination with disappearance wasn't born from curiosity alone. It came from experience, from something he had already done, quietly, carefully, without leaving a trace. And though he appeared invisible to the world, Corey Vale had already begun to make himself unforgettable in the most chilling way possible. 2 days after Elliot Maris vanished, the town of Windermere woke to grim news that spread faster than the morning fog. A group of teenagers searching near Blackthorn Woods had stumbled upon something unusual: an old, mud-caked shoe lying just beyond a narrow trail. It looked small, the kind a boy would wear. When the police arrived, they found that the shoe matched the one Elliot had been wearing the day he disappeared. The discovery pulled search teams deeper into the woods, a place that had always carried an uneasy silence. What they found next would change Windermere forever. Hidden beneath a pile of damp leaves and broken branches, officers uncovered Elliot's body. The scene was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of wet soil and decay. But what struck investigators most was the strange precision of it all. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of panic. The injuries were controlled, deliberate, and coldly efficient, as though whoever had done it had studied exactly what they were doing. Even the area around the body seemed untouched, carefully arranged, as if the killer had taken time to ensure nothing looked out of place. It was an act that felt too deliberate, too thoughtful, for someone driven by rage or impulse. The news broke across every channel in the country. Cameras flooded Windermere, reporters filled the narrow streets, and the town's residents locked themselves indoors. The image of Elliot's smiling face, once a symbol of hope during the search, now became the face of tragedy. Police appealed for witnesses, retraced routes, and questioned anyone who might have seen something unusual. But the more they investigated, the stranger the case became. No fingerprints, no footprints, no DNA. Whoever had taken Elliot had left behind nothing, almost as if they had planned the entire thing with unsettling intelligence. Forensic teams tried to piece together the timeline, but every path led to confusion. Elliot's school bag was missing, his watch gone, and his pockets empty. Yet his clothes were neatly arranged, not torn or disordered. It looked less like an act of violence and more like an experiment. Investigators debated theories late into the night. Some thought it was the work of a local recluse or a passing stranger. Others began to whisper that the killer had to be someone from the town, someone who understood its rhythms, its hidden corners, and its secrets. As police patrolled the streets, Corey Vale watched from the edge of the crowd near the school gates. He observed the flashing lights, the officers marking boundaries, and the crying families. His face remained still, unreadable. The tragedy fascinated him in ways even he couldn't explain. He listened carefully to the detectives discussing evidence, memorizing every word. When they spoke of the shoe, he blinked slowly, as if confirming something only he knew. That night, while Windmere mourned, Corey sat alone in his room. He opened his notebook and began writing in neat, careful letters. The first words on the fresh page were simple but chilling. Observation, success. Subject responded as predicted. Outside, rain lashed against his window, but Corey didn't notice. He was too focused, too calm. To him, the discovery in the woods wasn't an end. It was only the beginning of something far darker, something he had planned to understand completely. When police officers arrived at the small house where Corey Vale lived with his grandmother, they expected another routine interview. They had already spoken with most of Elliot's classmates, and Corey's name appeared on the list simply because he was in the same year. His quiet behavior at school had drawn no real suspicion. But when the officers stepped inside, they felt something they couldn't explain, a kind of stillness that didn't feel natural. The house was neat, too neat, as if it had been arranged by someone obsessed with order. Every surface shone, every object sat at a perfect angle. There were no toys, no posters, no trace of ordinary teenage life. It felt more like a museum than a home. Corey's grandmother welcomed the detectives politely, insisting her grandson was upstairs doing homework. She smiled nervously, unaware that behind that door the boy she loved had already buried a secret that would horrify the entire town. The officers asked a few casual questions about Corey's school life and his friendship with Elliot. The grandmother explained that Corey didn't have many friends and preferred spending time reading. Her words were harmless, innocent even, but they planted a seed of curiosity in one of the officers. Something about the boy's isolation, his calmness amid chaos, didn't sit right. When Corey came downstairs, he looked calm, his uniform spotless, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He answered questions with precision, never hesitating, never showing emotion. He said he had gone straight home after school on the day Elliot disappeared. His grandmother confirmed it. The interview seemed to end without issue, but as the officers were leaving, one noticed something odd. A faint smear of dirt on Corey's shoes, dried and almost invisible. It matched the reddish soil found near Blackthorn Woods. A warrant was issued quietly that evening. The next day, detectives returned to search the house. They found nothing unusual in the open spaces, no blood, no clothing, no visible evidence of a crime. But when one officer tried to open a locked drawer in Corey's desk, the grandmother mentioned it was where he kept private things, like drawings and letters. The lock was simple, and with her hesitant permission, they opened it. What they found froze the room in silence. Inside lay a thin, battered notebook, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting and disturbing sketches. Each page seemed to document an experiment, lists of dates, locations, and notes on human behavior. Some pages included rough maps of Windmere with trails and hiding spots marked in red ink. The most horrifying pages were at the back, filled with drawings that matched the very scene in Blackthorn Woods where Elliot had been found. Even the arrangement of the leaves and branches was identical. But what made the discovery truly chilling was the timing. The journal entries describing the scene were dated 2 days before Elliot's body was discovered. The final page was written in dark pencil, almost engraved into the paper from the pressure of the strokes. It contained only one line: "Test subject complete." The words were small but deliberate, written by a steady hand. The detectives exchanged glances, realizing what this meant. This was not the journal of an imaginative child. It was the diary of a calculated killer. Corey Vale had documented the entire process like a scientist observing a controlled study. And now, the truth they had feared most was undeniable. The murderer they were searching for wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. It was a boy sitting quietly in his grandmother's house, watching the investigation unfold as if it were just another experiment he had already predicted. The trial of Corey Vale began under a cloud of disbelief. Britain had seen young offenders before, but nothing like this. The idea that a 13-year-old boy could plan and execute a killing so methodical, so emotionless, left the nation stunned. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, their faces pressed against metal barriers as reporters shouted over one another, trying to capture any glimpse of the boy at the center of the storm. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and unnervingly quiet. Corey sat in the defendant's chair, dressed in a gray suit far too large for his small frame. His expression remained calm, his posture perfect, as though he were merely observing the proceedings rather than being the focus of them. The prosecution presented evidence piece by piece. They displayed the journal that had been found in his locked drawer, the sketches of the forest, the detailed descriptions of Elliot's final moments. The lead detective spoke about the eerie precision of the crime scene, how everything had been arranged with purpose, and how Corey's writing matched that same cold order. Experts in psychology and child behavior were brought in, but none could fully explain what had driven a 13-year-old to commit such an act. Some said he lacked empathy entirely, that his brain simply didn't register emotion like others. Others believed he understood what he was doing perfectly and just didn't care. Corey's defense lawyer tried to paint a picture of a lonely, neglected child, isolated and emotionally stunted by years of abandonment. His parents' absence, his reclusive nature, and his obsession with crime stories were all presented as signs of a disturbed mind rather than a malicious one. But when asked to show remorse, Corey remained silent. He stared ahead, his eyes distant and unblinking, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. It was this silence that terrified people more than anything else. As the trial went on, disturbing new details emerged. Investigators found that Corey had planned the murder weeks in advance. He had designed a fake treasure hunt, leaving clues that would lead Elliot into the woods. Witnesses remembered Corey talking about adventure maps at school, and one student admitted that Corey had offered him a chance to join the game, but he had refused. Those words, "a game," echoed through the courtroom, chilling everyone who heard them. This wasn't a sudden outburst of violence. It was a carefully constructed plan, executed with precision and no trace of conscience. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell silent. Corey Vale was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in a secure facility for young offenders. His grandmother wept quietly in the back row, clutching a photo of the boy she thought she knew. Corey didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. He simply stood when told and followed the guards without resistance. For the people of Windermere, justice had been served, but there was no relief. The horror of what he had done lingered like a shadow over the town. Parents held their children closer, afraid of what darkness might hide behind young faces. And though Corey was locked away, many couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that somewhere deep inside him, the experiment wasn't over. 5 years after Corey Vale was sentenced, the name that had once filled every newspaper headline was barely spoken aloud. Windermere tried to forget. The school repainted its halls, the woods near Blackthorn were fenced off, and the house where Corey had lived with his grandmother remained empty, its curtains drawn like eyelids that refused to open. People said time would heal, but for those who remembered, the unease never fully left. Then, one stormy night in late October, the past came back to life. At the secure youth facility in northern England, where Corey was being held, rain hammered against the concrete walls as wind howled through the gates. The staff were used to bad weather, but that night something felt different. Power flickered, alarms blared, and security cameras went black for almost 6 minutes. When the lights came back on, Corey's cell was empty. His bed was made, his uniform neatly folded, his notebook lying open on the desk. The final entry, written in small, perfect letters, read, "End of observation. Commencing next phase." Search teams scoured the surrounding countryside, checking every road, tunnel and farmhouse within miles, but no trace was found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Officials speculated that the storm caused an electrical failure, allowing him to slip through an unlocked gate. Yet the theory didn't make sense. None of the other inmates had moved, and the outer security doors were found intact, locked from the inside. Someone must have helped him, though no employee ever confessed or was charged. The only clue was a missing maintenance van that was later found abandoned near the coast, its engine still warm, its tracks leading toward the cliffs. Rumors began spreading almost instantly. Some believed Corey had fallen into the sea, swept away by the storm. Others whispered that he had been rescued by an underground group fascinated by his case. People who viewed him as a symbol of untapped genius rather than evil. Conspiracy forums exploded with theories that the government had secretly transferred him elsewhere, away from public scrutiny. The official statement declared Corey Vale, presumed deceased, though no body was ever recovered. Windermere reacted with dread. Families who had finally found peace locked their doors again. Journalists flooded the area, but after weeks of searching, the story faded. Only a few investigators kept following leads, unconfirmed sightings, strange letters, and anonymous tips from abroad. Every report seemed to carry the same unsettling detail: a man or boy with calm eyes, soft-spoken, unnervingly polite. In the years that followed, the name Corey Vale disappeared from headlines, buried under newer scandals and tragedies. But for those who remembered his blank stare and the cold intelligence behind it, the idea that he might still be alive became an unspoken fear. Somewhere out there, perhaps across an ocean, a young man who had once studied death like a science experiment was free again. Whether he had drowned, escaped, or been hidden away, one thing was certain: Corey Vale had left behind more questions than answers, and the silence of his disappearance was far more terrifying than any confession he could have given. 17 years passed before the name Corey Vale surfaced again, this time thousands of miles from where his story had begun. In 2015, a quiet town in Oregon called Misty Creek was shaken by a series of strange and brutal crimes. 3 victims, all under the age of 16, were found in wooded areas on the outskirts of town. The scenes were disturbingly clean with little evidence left behind. The local sheriff described them as too organized for any ordinary killer. The details were eerily familiar to those who remembered the Windermere case: the precise placement of objects, the absence of footprints, and the calm calculation behind every move. The resemblance was so uncanny that one detective remarked it felt as if the same hands were at work decades and an ocean apart. Among those who noticed was a British journalist named Daniel Frost. He had covered the original Corey Vale trial as a young reporter and never forgot the blank face of the boy who had murdered without emotion. When he heard about the Oregon cases, something in his gut told him it was more than coincidence. He flew to the United States, determined to investigate what everyone else refused to see. The American authorities dismissed his theories, insisting the killings were isolated incidents, but Daniel found small details that told another story. Symbols carved into trees near the victims, tiny, almost hidden, matched the sketches once found in Corey's journal. The same meticulous symmetry, the same unnerving precision. Digging deeper, Daniel traced a lead to a man named Colin Vance, a British immigrant who had settled in Oregon about 6 years earlier. Colin was quiet, polite, and well-liked by neighbors. He worked at a small mechanic's shop and lived alone in a rented cabin near the forest, but something about his background didn't fit. His immigration papers were legitimate, yet several details were oddly vague: no traceable school records, no birth certificate, and a history that seemed to begin from nothing. Daniel requested fingerprint comparisons from the authorities, who reluctantly agreed. The results came back weeks later, and they confirmed what he already suspected: a partial match between Colin Vance and the long-missing Corey Vale. Instead of an official investigation, the results were quietly buried. The local police received orders to close the case, and Daniel was warned not to publish his findings. It was as if someone wanted Corey's existence erased again, just as it had been before. But the journalist refused to give up. He continued to collect evidence, interviews, photographs, and handwritten notes from witnesses who claimed they had seen Colin wandering into the forest late at night. In every account, he was calm, polite, and eerily composed, just as Corey had been. Then, suddenly, Colin Vance disappeared. His cabin was found empty, his belongings gone except for a single notebook left on the kitchen table. The first page contained only a sentence written in small, even handwriting. "They still don't understand." It was enough for Daniel to know he was right. The boy Britain once called its youngest killer had not died. He had grown, adapted, and crossed oceans to continue his silent experiments under a new name, and somewhere in the forests of Oregon the next chapter of his story was already being written. When Daniel Frost tried to publish his investigation linking Colin Vance to Corey Vale, he was met with an unexpected wall of silence. Major newspapers refused to run his story. Editors who had once encouraged his work suddenly avoided his calls. Within weeks, his press credentials were revoked without explanation. Files he had saved on cloud drives vanished, and his personal notes were taken during what authorities called a random inspection. It was as if someone powerful wanted the story to disappear before it ever reached the public, but Daniel knew too much to walk away. What he uncovered next would expose a truth far darker than anyone had imagined. A truth that governments on both sides of the Atlantic had quietly tried to bury. Through contacts in London, Daniel obtained confidential records from a defunct government initiative known as Project Reformation. It had been a joint program between the United Kingdom and the United States, established under the guise of juvenile rehabilitation. Its purpose was to reform youth offenders through psychological reconditioning and identity reconstruction. In reality, it was an experiment. Children convicted of serious crimes were secretly transferred to undisclosed facilities, where their memories were manipulated, their identities erased, and their behavior studied for years. Among those transferred was Corey Vale. His disappearance from the secure youth facility in 2003 had not been an escape. It had been sanctioned. The program relocated him to the United States under a new identity, Colin Vance. According to the documents, Corey had been one of the project's most promising cases. He showed high cognitive ability, exceptional control, and a willingness to adapt to new environments. The files claimed he had been successfully rehabilitated, but progress reports stopped abruptly, and after that there were no further records, no monitoring, no accountability. When the murders in Oregon occurred, the program had already been quietly shut down and its archives sealed under national security orders. Daniel realized he was sitting on evidence that could ruin reputations and expose a decade of moral corruption. But every time he got close to revealing it, something went wrong. Emails deleted, sources recanting, strange cars parked outside his home. One night, as he prepared to record a video statement for release online, he found an unmarked envelope pushed under his door. Inside was a single page from a familiar notebook, written in the same meticulous handwriting, where the words, "I am not a mistake, I am the result." That was the last anyone heard from Daniel Frost. His apartment was found empty 2 days later, his laptop destroyed, his phone crushed on the floor. Police called it a disappearance, though no investigation followed. The story of Corey Vale, or Colin Vance, or whatever name he used next, was never officially acknowledged again. Yet in quiet corners of the internet, fragments of Daniel's research still surface, files, photos, and scanned documents that authorities scramble to erase. Each time a message appears alongside them, observation continues. To this day, both governments deny that Project Reformation ever existed. No official record of Corey Vale remains in the National Archives. Some say he died long ago. Others insist he lives under another new identity, continuing his research, far from the public eye. Whether truth or legend, one fact remains impossible to ignore. Somewhere the mind of Britain's youngest killer is still watching, still learning, and still waiting for the world to notice again.